Yo, Philly, how you's doing? Welcome to Philadelphia Baseball, past, present, and personal, brought to you by the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. I'm Bill Kashatus, your host for the podcast. Each week, we'll explore Philadelphia's rich baseball history with a special guest. He might be a former major or minor league player, a baseball historian, beat writer, or some other personality associated with the city's past. This week, I'm pleased to have as my guest Howie Bedell. Howie began his Major League Baseball career with the Milwaukee Braves in 1962, and he ended it with our own Philadelphia Phillies in 1968. Afterwards, he coached in the Phillies farm system until 1980, when he was promoted to farm director. Howie has a special ability as a teacher-coach that allowed him to cultivate major league talent. During his tenure, the Phillies developed such players as Marty Bystrom, Randy Lerch, Keith Moreland, Lonnie Smith, and Bob Walk, all of whom played instrumental roles in winning the Phillies' first World Championship in 1980. Of course, Ryan Sandberg, who went on to a Hall of Fame career with the Chicago Cubs, was another of Bedell's proteges. Wherever Howie landed after Philadelphia, the organization he joined captured a World Series. It happened in 1985 with the Kansas City Royals, where Howie served as coordinator of field instruction and bench coach, and in 1990 with the Cincinnati Reds, where he served as director of player development. Howie is a baseball insider, a man who has always worked behind the scenes, but whose contributions to the Phillies and to the game itself have been critical to their success. Welcome to the show, Howie.
Good to be with you.
I'd like to start by turning the clock back to Saturday, June 8th, 1968, when you were a veteran outfielder with the Phillies. On that day, you made the history books by stroking a sacrifice fly deep to center field that ended Dodger pitcher Don Drysdale's consecutive scoreless inning streak at 58 2/3 innings. Tell us about the circumstances surrounding that historic feat.
Well, it's something that I've had to think about year after year, and at my age, just thinking about something like this is a real chore. So I'm going to give you the best I can off the top of my head. Actually, I was playing in Reading, Double-A baseball for the Philadelphia Phillies, and Frank Casey. I was his baseball coach, I guess, at the time as a player. I must have been close into my middle 30s at that point. And we had just finished a game in Elmira, New York. And we were having some dinner before we headed back to Reading. And I had a call in the middle of the day that they were calling me up to join the ball club in San Francisco in 2 days. And, of course, being that age and having played as long as I did, there were oftentimes pranks being played on you with the different team members, and we had a bunch of jokers on the ball club. So I thought, yeah, sure. At 30-some years old, Gene Mock would really like to have me in San Francisco. So, but the call did come. I took the call, and as we sat and had some dinner before, I had an automobile that I had to drive back rather than come back with a team. And as I said to Frank, I said, you know, this is crazy. He said, well, I want to say something to you before you leave. And he was always very, very good to me. He helped break me in as not only a player coach, but to help me manage later on. And the point was, he said, you know, you're going to get a chance to break Don Drysdale's pitching streak. And, of course, Frank was an optimist all the time, and I said, yeah, really. And, of course, I still couldn't believe it. They even called me up, let alone break Don Drysdale's streak. And finally, I left with that in my mind and drove from Elmira back here to Pennsylvania, our home, and Bob Quinn picked me up the next morning at 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning. I know my wife, Judy, was really surprised with all of this going on, and he picked picked me up at my home and drove me to the airport in Philadelphia. As I sat on that airplane, and by the way, first class, can you imagine?
Yeah.
In 1968, a minor league player riding first class, headed for San Francisco. And I've been there. I was there before in the big leagues in '62, briefly, with the Braves. So I was aware of some of the things that went on, but it had been so long, and I'd been riding the buses, so I remember taking my shoes off, sitting in first class and relaxing when they went to bring us breakfast. I thought to myself, the minor leagues aren't ready. This isn't the way it works. And, of course, once we landed in San Francisco, I grabbed a cab as fast as I could, my bag with my gear in, and asked the cabbie to get me to the airport, to the ballpark as fast as possible. So, and he did. He really raced. I told him it was important, and of course, when I got into the Candlestick, I found myself hustling to try to get a uniform on, and they were trying to get me to sign a contract and playing the national anthem. Well, the reason I wanted to do that was I got an extra day in the big leagues. So, and that was very, very important. All these things were happening so fast in the last 3 days, and finally got on the field, and Gene Mock and our great player, Dick Allen, were having a little feud at that particular time. And so I was sitting on the bench with Dick, and I asked him, I said, what is going on with you and Gene? And he just grumbled that we have a misunderstanding. Well, I wasn't accustomed to all this because I just came out of the minor leagues, and pretty much we did things by the book, and Frank Lucchese was pretty strict on how he ran things in Reading, and wasn't accustomed to people being unhappy. Well, one thing led to another, and we completed the game. A very interesting part of that particular game that Dick had a fashion of not just pulling his pants on and his shoes and his shirt. He had nothing else on. And George Myatt was managing the ball club, and Gene was at third base, and basically because from time to time Dick would leave the bench and go down to the bullpen, and one thing led to another, and we needed Dick to pinch hit in about the 7th, 8th inning. He'd been down the bullpen. He came down, sat next to me, and I said, the coach wants you to pinch hit, Dick. And he said, yeah, I know. He said, look, I'll hit one out here and just come on back. Well, doggone if he didn't go up there on the third pitch, he hit the ball. God, he nailed it.
Amazing.
And I'm thinking to myself, this can't be. None of this is happening. Remember, I'm only 4 days removed from the minor leagues, watching all this going on. Well, we finally got into, my roommate was Don Locke, and Don was an outfielder. We had known each other for some time. And of all things happening, that was the night that the Kennedy got shot at the hotel. And our whole ball club was in tears and so forth and so on. The next morning, we passed by the hotel where it all happened, and I got a big kick out of the people in the marquee. The Righteous Brothers were performing. So I do remember some of this stuff as we went along. Now, we got into Los Angeles, and I went to the ballpark before anyone. And the reason for that, if they were going to get me off the field, they were going to have to take the uniform off. So I got the uniform on, and I was playing pepper with the Bat Boys, and Gene Mock came out of the clubhouse. I guess someone told him I was out in the field, and he came out. He called me over, and we sat and talked a little bit about being in the big leagues, and I thanked him for. At that point, I hadn't had a chance to say anything to him with all this other stuff happening. And he said to me, I'm going to probably use you. This is how perceptive this guy was. He said, I'm going to use you in about the 6th or 7th inning to break Don Drysdale's streak.
He said that.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, I'm still in awe. I've only been up there now 4 or 5 days, and I thought when he came over and called me over the bench, he was going to send me back. I I thought my time was in the big leagues was over in 5 days. But he welcomed me. He was very, very. I mean, and he said to me, he said, "Al, he's probably not doing anything different than he did when you faced him in 1962." Because I was with Braves at the time, and I had faced him earlier, and I think I did get a hit off of him, as few hits as I had in the big leagues. I'm pretty sure I had a hit off of him before that, and he said he's not doing anything more. He'll intimidate you with something inside, and he'll go away with you. Probably use his fastball as much as anything. And chances are he does. And this is Gene speaking. Chances are he doesn't even know who you are. So, and there would be no reason for it probably. And as it turned out, when I did get a chance, Taylor got on. And then Clay got on, of course. They both had singles, and we had first and third. And Pena came up, and of course, he decked Pena. I mean, he knocked him flat down. And so as he got himself ready to do something else at the plate, he eventually struck him out. But we had first and third, actually, and when I hit the ball. But as I stepped up to the plate, I remember Gene's final words. He's not going to do anything different than he did in '62, Howie. Look, imagine 6 days ago I was hitting in Elmira, New York. Now I'm hitting against probably one of the, arguably one of the better pitchers in baseball of all time. And he wasn't always a friendly guy. He'd like to intimidate you by coming inside, and you didn't really, during those days, you didn't charge the mound. You basically sat back and took your medicine, and you played the game. If you got hit, you got up, went to first base, and that was it, and retaliation later on. One thing led to another, and as I stepped up to the plate, he threw me 2 pitches before I made contact with the ball. I hit the ball to left center, and I like to say it was a hard line drive. I get kidded about the fact it was a long fly ball. But the truth of the matter, and your listeners should know, it was a hard line drive.
Who scored?
And the interesting part of it, Bill, was that the left fielder, Len Gabelson, was my roommate the first year with the Braves. So he knew exactly that I hit balls up the alley on the right side, even though I was a left-handed hitter. I did pull a ball and would hit the middle occasionally, but I would hit a ball in that left center area. Well, he admitted later on, he told me he remembered where I used to hit the ball, so he moved three steps over, and he actually made a diving catch. He was on his stomach. That's the real deal there. And then, of course, he tried to get up to throw Tony out, and not possible.
So it was Tony Taylor that scored.
Tony Taylor scored the run, and to this day, Tony, we were just together here a couple of weeks ago, Philly, and Tony says, he always gives me a hug and says, you and me and Don Drysdale. He said, now Don's gone, he said, and it's just you and me. So he said, we got to carry on. So it's interesting you asked this question. I've given you a long answer, and but I want to finish it by saying, and it's pretty important to me, I was managing some years later in the Midwest or Southwest League, and I had the opposing manager come to me. We were playing the Dodger Farm Club, and he said, Don died last night. Wow. Sitting in his chair in the hotel. And I want to say to you that, I got to know him over the years. We did some broadcasts together on the different anniversaries. So this streak lasted quite a long time until Hershiser finally did that extra third of an inning. And by the way, for your listeners, Hershiser went 1/3 of an inning, but the streak that Hershiser had was never broken by a hitter. It was broken by the year ending. And right. So I hold the dubious distinction of breaking the longest pitching streak in history, and to this day, there's not been anyone with a better record than that, because Now someone would have to pitch that same amount of innings plus a third, and an offensive player break it. Now, there was a baseball historian that brought that to my attention and said that's a record that never, ever will be broken. He said you'll go to your grave with that as your moniker. So I often think about people that keep these stats, what they really mean, but how personal this really was to our family and the Philly family, and they celebrate it every year when they call me to walk on the field down here in Philadelphia.
That's a great story. Now, Howie, we've known each other now just about a decade, and I know that you are too modest of an individual to talk about your post-playing career and some of the achievements that you've had, but I've also run into a lot of the lives that you've touched. For example, Hall of Famer Ryan Sandberg and George Brett, they credit you with having had a very, very profound impact on their careers. We've already talked about Dick Allen, a former teammate. He considers you a member of his family. Dallas Green would not have managed the 1980 World Champion Phillies if it hadn't been for your recommendation to then General Manager Paul Owens to give Dallas that job. You were also among the first phone calls that managers Lou Piniella and Joe Torre made when they were trying to assemble coaching staffs. So it sounds like you were more of a teacher, coach, and an advisor than others who have held managerial positions. Can that be accurate? Were you?
Well, I think that's a fine description and probably observation of parts of my career. Bill, I think in all deference to, and you're right on many occasions with some of the friendships and so forth that we make, but some of that was all happenstance and probably on my part not a real concern about my career or a direction that I may go. Now, it may sound strange to your listeners that you'd have someone that would be involved with baseball to the extent that I was and never paid much attention to some of all the different things that go on in the game itself. And I think your assessment is correct. I've always been interested in why things do happen as athletes. From the time I was in school, in high school, I always wondered why I was selected to do some of the things I did as a player, and whether it would be football, basketball, or baseball. Played all three here for years, but the one gift that I think probably I would have was given to me at birth by my mother and father. It was I was given the ability to run very fast, and as you know, and your listeners know, foot speed and agility probably plays the greatest role in the three sports that I've just mentioned. Now, obviously, I had to learn hand-eye coordination and develop that kind of skill to play basketball, and of course, in football, enough toughness to make myself an all-state and an all-American football player at the high school level, and actually received the better part of 60 scholarships to go to some major universities and schools. But I think going back and trying to answer that one question is rather difficult for me. My interest in why things did happen, why I was able to run from home to first in what is considered the fastest time ever posted at 2.9, and your listeners will scratch their heads saying, well, that's exactly, if you count it out for me, it was a 12 strides. So those kind of things I was given at birth. And I credit the people around me, the coaches I had through grammar school and high school and into college with Glenn Killinger at Westchester for bringing some of that out. But there's also another side of me, and I think that's maybe where this interest in learning and doing things. I never really thought too much of the outcome, but look for answers. to problems that we had. Some know, and you know, I developed a thing called slide step conditioning programs in my career. Were they big deals? I never thought they were. I just thought they were things that, as individuals, we all do in connection with our chosen field. And as you know, I've never really held a real job. I never have considered any of that real job. I have, and I think this is probably the wonder why I didn't spend more time in the major leagues, or why I'm 82 years old now and still think I have some idea about baseball, but I'm not outright working in the game itself. But I guess you'd be surprised the number of calls and that I get from different ball players even today that know me or been referred to me. That's really flattering. The truth of the matter is that these things that we do each and every day, how much do we really know that they affect the direction that we're really going to take? And when it gets right down to it, we don't really have a good say in all that. And I think in professional sports, it really, in my point of time, really was real. I went through, I'm, as I say, 82 years old, been in baseball probably over 50 years, and you do just what you have to do, not to get by, but to make the game a little better or your life a little better. And I think that's where I found myself without ever really giving some thought. Now, you particularly, you make me think about these things, and others who ask me to look inside, you come up with some answers. But the real answer is we probably don't really know what tomorrow is going to bring, or our destiny in whatever career we may choose.
You know, you mentioned Glenn Killinger, who was longtime athletic director, as well as the head football and head baseball coach at Westchester University. And I know many of our listeners probably have never heard of him, but he was an exceptional individual. He was among the first generation of All-American collegiate football players in the early 1920s. He quarterbacked at Penn State. He went on to play in the NFL, I think briefly for the Canton Bulldogs and the New York Giants. He also played minor league baseball. I mean, this was a guy who was your inspiration. I'm wondering if you could share maybe some of his philosophy and tell us what elements of Killy's philosophy you took and applied it as, in baseball.
Well, the answer is it's a simple one, but at the same time it becomes complex in the time period and what Dr. Killinger meant to a person like myself. He immediately at age, I was just 18 years old, and I think your listeners may be interested in this. I was ineligible to play baseball my last year in high school because I was reaching the age of 19, and I had played all my semesters and did everything you need to do during that period of time. Being recruited by many colleges, and Dr. Killinger, Coach Killinger, had asked me to come over to the school. I've been over earlier, and he called me one day and he said, could you be over here tomorrow at 11 o'clock in the morning, Howie, and bring your spikes and your undershirts and everything. He said, we're going to do a little workout. Well, I came over. I was there promptly at 9. The one thing you learn with Dr. Killinger, you're always on time. I would say that. That was important. And of course, once you showed up, he expected you to either perform or do what you came to do. And I found that out over the years that I was associated with him. He became a second father to me in many ways. But upon showing up this particular day, I was told to go downstairs, and they gave me a Westchester uniform and to report to the field at 1 o'clock, which was directly behind Wayne Hall there in Westchester at the dorm. And, of course, I did that sitting on the bench, and all at once our team showed up, and Coach came out, and he told me, go ahead and warm up with the guys. You're going to play center field. Well, what's a guy out of high school thinking? I figured it's just another day, and how naive I was. The next thing I know, another college showed up. And I won't give you the college name at this particular time. I don't know if it would be the best thing to do, although we can't forfeit the game at this point. And but I played against a college when I was in high school,
wow.
Attending a workout in Westchester. Now, and in the eighth inning, after having a double or triple, stealing 2 bases and playing center field, Coach met me coming off the field. He said, "I want you to go and put your uniform down and go home and see me Monday." And that's what I did. We actually beat the other college that particular day, and it wasn't until some period of time later that I realized that I played in the college game. And now you can say what you want and what that meant, but I did play under the name of Joe Black, you should know, which was rather interesting at that time. Another incident once I got over to school, and I had been playing basketball for Dr. Messicomer, and I started as a freshman. I could dunk the ball and do all kinds of crazy stuff with the basketball. So I playing basketball, but I developed a hernia, so I had to have it operated. And I said, "Well, I got to play against Temple because I knew I'd never get a chance to do that again." No, Villanova. And so the doctors operated Thanksgiving, put me in whatever they needed to do. I got myself and I played. Then Kerry didn't allow me to play the last 2 basketball games, but I had to come out on the baseball field. This was my freshman year. This was about 1 year. And he said to me, "Would you go up in the track with Dr. Clokey?" Well, they had a dual meet with Temple and I think it was Villanova as well, dual meet and track, and they wanted me to run the 100-yard dash. And I went up to see the coach, and he said, "Yeah, loosen up." He said, "You'll run in this next heat." Well, I ran against the number six guy in the country, a fellow by the name of Jackson, and I'm starting at a starting line with my baseball shoes, a baseball pants, and a shirt in a regular track meet. This guy had his track outfit. He was about 6'1", and could flat out fly. He was one of the best in the country. And I didn't really know it at the time. And the starter said to me, "Get down." I said, "Well, I don't know how to get down." So I just stood like I was stealing second base. So I stood in that position. I beat the guy by 2 strides. And he looked at me as he went by me at the finish line, and he said, "You're not going to run the 220, are you?" I said, "No, I'm going back down on the baseball field." And so Kelly was waiting for me watching the race, and then he waved to me to come down the baseball field.
So what you're saying, though, is that Kelly was a guy who believed in multiple sport athletes, but in the end, that was not the case with you because you wanted to play football, and he told you you're not going to be a football player. You're going to be a baseball player.
Yeah, this is one of the things that I would say about my coach, Dr. Killinger. He always asked me to call him Kelly, and it was hard for me to do it, but I did it. We had many personal meetings and personal talks and so forth and so on, and he meant so much to me because he had a special insight into the athlete. I would come out to watch football practice, and I would stand, and we had a couple of little All-Americans on the team that were good. They lived in the dorm where I was living, and they kept saying, they saw me play in high school, and they said, "You got to go get the pads, Howie," and of course, all Coach would have had to say was put the pads. Many times at practices, I would watch right out there behind Wayne Hall. He would back up when he was coaching. He'd say, "I know you'd like to be out here, but just watch it." He said, we don't want you hurt. And so he never really encouraged me to go on the football field, other than when I finally received my degree. I had signed my contract that year after he sent me to Watertown, South Dakota, in a college league. And when I came back, I went to what would be the third semester of college, I guess, and I'd be a sophomore. And I finished that year, and then I left school I only had 2 years of college. I went down to do my thing with the Braves. At the time, I signed with the Braves, but it was about 6 years later, after I had completed my baseball with the Braves, and then it looked as if I probably wouldn't get a chance to go back to the big leagues as a regular player. I received a call from the school, asked me to come over. I met with Coach, and I'll never forget, we had a conversation. He said, now here's your schedule. You start Monday. This was in the wintertime. I said, Doc, I can't. I said, I'm married, I have 2 kids, and can't do that. And he pulled me over to the desk. He had me lean over, and I leaned over. If he knew, he had a big nose, and it was gross. I mean, to the point where, but to me, it was like beautiful. And put his finger up at me, and he said, Howie, you can't afford not to come back to school. Here's your schedule. And Judy and I took the next 5 semesters, and did it. And of course, then I continued to play ball up here in York in the Eastern League at the time. But the crazy part of it was he never left me. He never left me until he passed. And I'm sure I'm not the only person that had his support. He was a man with broad shoulders. So many stories I could tell your listeners, and how he gave me a heads up and so forth. And you should know, with all those scholarships I had, including a chance to go to West Point, I received no money to go to Westchester. I went to Westchester because I thought I wanted to be a coach and a teacher, and baseball along the way I've never been out of baseball. And so let's
talk a little bit about your Phillies years, because there was another mentor that you had there, and his name was Paul Owens. He had served as the Phillies farm director and later the general manager and field manager. Owens was in fact the architect of the 1980 World Championship team, and you were part of his brain trust. I'm wondering what you could tell us about how Owens made others, whether they were players, coaches, or scouts, accountable to his philosophy.
Well, you hit on we could do hours on this, because, as you know, I spent over 20 some odd years, he and I together, before I really left and went to Kansas City and on with a career. But he was an enigma, is a good word to use in the vernacular of trying to describe him as an individual. He inspired those around him to do what they could do and beyond. And I say that in all deference to the fact that, he had a terrific reputation coming out of school. He was a player himself, coming out of school and scouting all those years, and then, of course, going into the front office and the struggle he had with, name's missing now, the GM that was there before him. You might help me with that. Mr. Quinn. Mr. Quinn was actually one of the signed me with the Braves. He came in for the Braves, but he actually took Mr. Quinn's position, and that's a whole story in itself, and a struggle to do that. But he had the support of scouts, as I recall, from the very beginning, because he was one. And if you've been in the game of baseball any length of time, you'll come to realize that your upbringing and your background in the game serves you all your life, depending on your position and what you were associated with, from the playing days to the coaching days to front office days. Anything that related to baseball can be of a tremendous help. And this man had perfected this leadership role with the scouts and with those of us who he brought aboard, including Dallas Green, and so many other scouts in the front office. And he was beloved by the secretaries, and this was very important. That the working bees, as we say, that get very little recognition for what they do on a daily basis as far as baseball is concerned. He had that great reputation and the ability to bring that out to you. I'll give you one quick thing because there's so much we can do in such short a time to do it. But Pete McCannon, who is presently the manager, I had been brought into the office. I'd been out in the field managing for 5 years, and Dallas had already been in there a year or so, and so I came in as basically assistant, and I ran the minor leagues. Dallas did the scouting. Now, it was not necessarily known that way in the open market, but that's a whole other story. But I handled the player type of situation as far as once they were signed and so forth. But I had a duty and responsibility to follow the drafts and the different lists that were available during the course of the year of players that was available. And I happened my first 10 days, Pete McCannon's name came up in these unrevocable contracts. And I'm not sure if it was Minnesota he's with or not, but anyway, I just went ahead and put the $20,000, sent a note down to the treasurer if I need $20,000 to send to this club for this ball player, and of course they sent the check, and of course Paul's getting this information late. I don't know if he was out of town or whatever, but he was in town this one morning, and he called over to my secretary. He said, "Would you ask Howie to come over to see me?" So I went over and I went in and sat down. Well, remember now I'm only in the front office now 3 weeks or so, and I didn't know protocol from Adam. I didn't know anything about this stuff, and I just knew it was my job to take who I wanted to do and do this and do that. So anyway, I sat for a moment. He looked at me. He said, "Who's this Pete McCannon?" I said, "Paul." I said, "He's a utility player." I said, I thought we could use him, and $20,000 seemed to. And he looked at me. He said, "Now let me tell you something." He said, "I don't know if he can play. I haven't seen him. I've looked at his record. I like his record." And he said, I respect you for what you did. But he said, "From now on, before you make a move and spend $20,000 or any of our money, would you please come see me first?" So I got a real growing up in a hurry, and Pete McCannon was the guy. Now, Pete played the rest of that year, the half a year, played the next half of the year and was traded. I don't know how we got him. But it wasn't until years later that Pete and I ran across each other, and those are stories for another time. But it was interesting that my first move in the front office was to draft a player from this list and get a reprimand from Paul. He said, and he used the phrase all the time. He says, if you're not right, I'm firing you. And I got fired so many times in Philadelphia. I can't count that many ways. After that, it just didn't really mean much to me.
Speaking of firing, a guy that used to fire from the hip was a guy, sadly, that we lost earlier in the year, Dallas Green. And you two were joined at the hip from 1974, I guess, through 1981 when he fired you, and that was Dallas Green. He was another one of Owen's acolytes, and another guy who made the players, the coaches, and scouts accountable. Dallas was not always that popular because he spoke his mind, but it was because of a guy like him, of course, that the Phillies got that first World Championship. And you told me an interesting story once about when he came in, how he cleaned house with the scouting department, which I thought was just amazing. But another fellow who was a close friend of yours, Ruben Amaro Sr., a longtime Phillies player and coach, he was largely responsible for the Phillies' initial efforts to scout and sign Latino players, something that his son, Ruben Jr., continued to do when he was GM here. And, of course, the current team has a lot of Latino players. But I'm wondering if you could tell us how that early effort at signing those Latino players began under Ruben Sr.
Well, you're correct. That seemed to be about the time when Ruben, Dallas, and myself. Now, Ruben, as you know, was a shortstop at the big league level. Played for the Phillies. They often kidded him. I'll never forget Jim Bunning says that, "Don't talk about your hitting, Ruben. Tell me about how you make the double play." They never gave Ruben much credit for hitting. In fact, Ruben said one time he had 2 strikes on him and they put the take sign on. So that kind of tells you what Ruben had to deal with all his career. But I worked with Ruben during that period of time when the transition was made from the player-coach type thing. And I will say this, that there wasn't anyone that we had in our staff or with us, Dallas, Paul, and myself, that we didn't have more respect for Ruben Amaro. Ruben was a constant promoter of the Latin American player, of which, one could find themselves not too happy about if you're trying to develop an overall picture for your franchise. However, his partiality to the Latin American player, and if you knew that and understood that, then your ability to evaluate whatever work was being done and whatever player was being spoken about was better received. And Ruben, there was none better than Ruben himself. And of course, eventually, his son came into the picture and played. And of course, all of our kids kind of grew up together. Dallas's children, our children, Ruben's children. So even to this day, there's a great fondness about all 3 of those families together. And the strange part, we're kind of all separated by our own fables and our own backgrounds and so forth. But I can't say enough about Ruben's ability. He would scout. He spent a lot of time scouting, did some managing, and of course, if you ever watched him play, he probably had a pair of the greatest hands that position has ever had in Philly.
Now, Ruben Sr. actually was responsible for signing such great players as Julio Franco, who unfortunately the Phillies let go, and he became a star with the Cleveland Indians at shortstop. I believe Juan Samuel was another of Ruben Sr.'s finds, but there were also some other ones that made you shake your head, like 14-year-old Jorge LeBron.
Oh, yeah.
Who didn't last more, I think, than single A. So it was hit and miss when that program really started. But from my understanding, you're right. Ruben Sr. had to constantly advocate for the Latino players. But that was really one of the more innovative things that the Phillies began in the 1970s, when the market was largely white and African American. There were other innovations that the Phillies had, and you were instrumental in some of them. I mean, not many folks are aware of your ability in this area. For example, I was once told by the late Darren Dalton that you were his inspiration to report to spring training camp in shape.
Yeah.
Though, Howie, I got to admit, he didn't exactly say it in those words. But he was referring to the continuous motion training you introduced to the farm system, something that replaced the archaic training methods of the early 1970s. I'm sure listeners would want to hear about what exactly was continuous motion training, and what were some of those archaic methods that it replaced.
Well, Bill, it's interesting that you bring it up. We could do a whole shift of hours on this doggone thing. The challenge was when I left the field and was Frank Lucchese's guy. I would over the Easter vacation, I would go to spring training. And I could not believe what I was seeing because I didn't go to spring training. I normally, my last 5 or 6 years, I just played the first day they came north. And the guys couldn't figure why I was in such great shape and could hit and do all that kind of stuff at that level. Now, you know, I wasn't a major league ball player. I was basically a AA, AAA ball player and had enough experience to do it. But I was always in great shape and would do things that kept me that way. And it wasn't until Frank said to me, he said, they want you to do some of the stuff in spring training, and they wouldn't let me run it. I had a fellow by the name of Dick Teed who was in the organization. He went with the Dodgers later on, and Dick was a scout that everyone accepted. The fraternity was very difficult on young guys with ideas, and so Dick ran my program. I actually wrote the spring training program in its entirety. With variations based on weather conditions for the for the entire 50 to 60 days we were in camp. So I actually knew what our last day in camp would be the very first day we went in. And of course, when we first employed this program in spring training, you can guess what this would do, what this did with the veteran coaches and managers. They just could not. They knew something was going on, but they knew it wasn't of their total making. Now, I guess I was bright enough to incorporate those who were there and ideas, because we always had what I called a gap in our program where we could insert those ideas, and it just fit in so nicely. So I developed that system, and that came as a result of my teaching background at Westchester. In other words, how to handle modules and different elements of being able to put programs together. Now, thank heavens for Westchester in that essence, because that helped me early on when I basically ran program, and it was easy for me to do. I truly enjoyed doing it. And the continuous motion program, you should know, and your listeners, that when we started that program, we would start at 7:30 in the morning and be finished not until 8:45. But we hadn't started spring training yet. Now you say, well, how does that work, Howie, when you have 150 guys out on the fields down at Carpenter Field? Well, what we did was we'd have them dressed and ready to go out, and we'd go through this set of programs, which I call continuous motion, but the more veterans would call it circle jerk. And they put them to their test for that period of time. We'd come in and change shirt for 15 minutes and be back on the field, and then we'd start our day's work. And the Phillies had never, ever done anything like this. And, of course, you can imagine some of the guys that were having to go through this weren't too happy. It made them very unhappy. And I'll never forget, we already been into the program many, many years, of course, in 1980 when Darren came in. I'll never forget when they took him into the Wall of Fame down here. He had his dad, nice man, such a nice man. My wife and I were up in the reception room, and we were there alone when he and his father came in, and he came into the room. He saw me at the other end, and lovingly he said, "Dad, there's that son of a bitch at the end of the." I guess we can say that on the air. That's a son of a bitch standing down at the other end. Well, my wife didn't know what to think of this, with Darren talking like this, and he and his father came down to me. He was a nice man, about 6'6", thin, in shape. And Darren gave me a normal hug, and my wife whispered in my ear, he says, "I love you, man." And, of course, went on to explain. Now, what Darren ran into was he thought he was in shape when he came in. He joined the Phillies in 80. And when he got into this, as he called it, the circle jerk, he realized. So what he said to his dad, he said, "This is the guy that gave me the opportunity to understand what it meant to be in shape." And
Howie, let me just insert something here. From my understanding, and Greg Luzinski even verified this, the types of training methods that were being used before the so-called circle jerk came in. If a guy had to lose weight, they'd put him in a rubberized sweatsuit, put an infield sled on him, a drag sled, and have him, basically jog or run the infield with that sled on his back.
That was one of the first things I did. They had a track out behind Carpenter Field. It was about 60 feet long, and they had the drag sled, as you say. And Greg was one that there were 3 or 4 guys that were involved with this, and Greg happened to be one because of his size and his weight. They put him out there at the end of the practice, and they punished him. And when I saw this, I came down, like I say, come down Easter vacations. I saw this. I said to my manager, look, this is crazy. What are they doing out there to him? And so when I actually took over that first year, the track was torn apart. We no longer had it there. And there's no sleds that we used to tie people up, or do we put? Some guys would always put a sweat outfit on. That would happen from time to time. I never encouraged it because of some of the dangers involved with it. And we really did hard work. I'd say 7:30 in the morning to just about 8:45, and we'd go, and then we'd be there till 5 o'clock with only two or three breaks in between. We had something going all the time. Now they've gotten back to that stuff where they don't stay that much in the camp. Guys come and go, but you're exactly right. There was a lot of punishing going on, and Greg was always a big man. He was always he's always in that 250 to 260 area, and he was not ever going to be 220 or 200 pounds. I don't care. And of course, if you saw him as a player, you realize maybe he didn't move as fast as anyone else, but he got to the balls in the outfield. He could play first base, and the neat part of it was he had a great bat. He got a great eye to hit, and he was an excellent hitter, and he was a what some of say a real tough athlete. He was the real deal. It remains to be the same today. His personality hasn't changed much, but we took the sleds away, and he and I have chatted about it from time to time. He just smiles. But those training methods some years ago existed. I'll never forget. We had a left-handed pitcher with the Braves when I joined him in Bradenton. The name escapes me now, but he was a veteran pitcher. He was about the end of his 2-year career, and he had a propensity for alcohol. And he would not stop in spring training. And, of course, I couldn't understand that because I've never used alcohol, so I never thought too much of it. But guys who did, during that time, that was part of it, coming to spring training, get rid of that stuff. And what they did was Dressen was the manager. And Dressen recognized I was in great shape. And as a rookie in the big league camp, he had me, the guy put his 2 fingers on my belt. And I ran, and he held on to my belt for the better part of 3 or 4 turns around that Bradenton field, the first 2 weeks of camp. And I always, and of course I like to run, so I didn't think a whole lot of it. I thought it was punishment for him, for this pitcher. But there are archaic methods used, and I think we were on the cutting edge of doing some things differently. The other thing is I never allowed trainers to come on the field unless we needed them. In other words, I felt managers and coaches need to be with the players at all times and having them do the kind of work that they need to do and play the kind of game. And the reason for that was to become familiar with your coach and manager to the point where it wasn't just 9 innings, but the manager and coaches understood your personality to some extent, rather than have trainers do this kind of stuff. Because so I had only trainers stand on the sideline. That was another thing that everyone looked at me in camp. They said I had managers and coaches, particularly the older guys, say, "Well, why do we have to go out there and hit fungos?" Or why do we have to go out there and spend time in the outfield when these guys run? Well, I tried to explain that from the point of view of familiarity and the fact that a new guy in camp, I didn't want him to know the trainer. The last thing I wanted him to do was go in that training room and get to know, Kenny and some of the guys that were in there. What I wanted them to get to know was their managers and coaches. And the neat part of it was during those years, that's exactly what happened. And guys like Boa and Ilya, I think were the two I'm thinking of real quick, and then there's probably 5 more guys that I could name or so forth. We become very familiar with our players and what they could and couldn't do, and it made us a better unit.
Howie, we're just about out of time, but I really want to get to this to one more issue here, because I think it really does reinforce your value to the Phillies organization. I don't like to play the woulda, coulda, shoulda game, but a lot of us who followed the Phillies back in the 1980s saw, after Dallas Green left in 82, after you left in 81, that the organization really did decline. By 1989, the Phillies had the lowest rated farm system in Major League Baseball, and that was after it was the Jewel farm system in Major League Baseball through the 70s and up to the early 80s. And I know that there were 4 players that you tried to protect, that there was no way you were going to let go. And those 4 players were Dalton, Ryne Sandberg, who went on to become a Hall of Famer with the Chicago Cubs, Julio Franco, who went on to become an all-star with the Texas Rangers, and George Bell, who became the 1987 American League MVP with the Toronto Blue Jays. Now, had the Phillies kept those players, because they got rid of all of them except Dalton after you left, consider the lineup that they would have had. Dalton at catcher. This is in 1989. They would have had this lineup. Dalton at catcher, Kruk at first base, Sandberg at second base, Julio Franco at short, Mike Schmidt, that was his last year in baseball, but he would have started the season at third base, Von Haven right field, Samuel in center field, and George Bell in left field. I can't help but feel that the Phillies' fortunes would have been very different had they held on to those 4 players. But the one that hurt the most probably was the trading of Sandberg, and that's gone down as the raping of Dallas Green as the general manager of the Chicago Cubs, the raping of the Phillies farm system. Would you have traded? Would you have allowed Sandberg to be traded if you were still in the organization? Or am I just looking at this the wrong way, that Sandberg at that period of time was really an unknown, and Boa was having problems with the Phillies organization, so it was just time to get rid of Boa, get a new shortstop, and Sandberg belonged as a throw-in in that trade. You know, what are your feelings?
Wow. Well, the idea, what if we can play those games all the time? I mean, there's a lot of games to be played. You're very astute, I think, in your observation that particular time, because there are those in baseball who have suggested to me that when I say those, I'm speaking to scouts both in Philadelphia and other places who observed this and would give me a jingle from time to time in Kansas City, where I was at that time with Brett and that group. You play something very, very interesting to contemplate, and the Philadelphia fan should know that if Howie Bedell would have been there, just Howie Bedell would have been there, there would have been an insurrection. We would not have, those people would not have gone. For example, the toss in over to Chicago in the Boa deal, that would have never happened. I would have never allowed Dallas to take him, and Paul really was not thinking. Not that he didn't think, because I love Paul, but that should have never ever happened. And the other names, there's similar situations. What your listeners should understand, that oftentimes in these trades there are things that go without saying openly to the public, and cause consternation within the organization. And depending upon where the strength of the organization may be at that time, many changes can come. And baseball, in all fairness, baseball kind of makes covers for some of this, and reasons that things do or don't happen. I think the names that you've mentioned, the talent that left the organization at that time, the organization was in a flux, and as a result, that's the best explanation I can give for it. And Dallas was very sharp. He knew that by throwing that one name in there that he could make the move, because Philadelphia wanted to make a trade for one reason or another. But isn't it interesting? The one guy that helped create that has been sitting on the bench for the last 10 years, helping the organization get better and better and better, and that's Larry Boa.
Yeah.
And I think your listeners should know that the dedication that Larry has to the game of baseball, and the caring that he has is second to none. I've been around so many fine Hall of Famers and so forth. This guy is so special, not only to the Phillies, but to the game of baseball. One quick story, and then I'll stop. I'm the guy that taught him to switch hit, and I'll never forget when I threw to him on the left side day after day, and have him stand at the plate and just tears coming down his eyes because he wasn't accomplishing everything he wanted to the first 15 minutes. That's the one thing about Larry. He wants to get it done in a hurry. And he was not able to do it. But eventually, that winter, as we kept working, he did what he did. And you know, the coming year, when he was doing what he was doing, he finally hit a home run from the left side and called me. And he said, "Did you see what I did today?" I forget. I think I was with Seattle at the time or whatever it was. But he was playing, and he hit his first home run from the left side. Now, of course, he was not a home run hitter, but the fact that he could switch hit, and he had the desire to do it, but he did it not with natural ability. He did it with hard work, guts, tears, and everything you can think of. And I think your listeners should know, here's a guy we traded a Hall of Famer to move him. In reality, Larry's back with the Phillies, and has been and will always be remembered as a Philly, and a great one.
Howie, thank you so much for being my guest today. You know, we're going to have you back again, since I know that we've only scratched the surface of your many contributions, not just to the Phillies, but to baseball. So promise that we're going to get you back.
Well, you know, it's a great game. Baseball's a great game. It's a great family business, but it's also a game, and we all should remember that. I think as we watch not only the Phillies of today, but as you talk about the Phillies in the past. Thank you for having me, Bill.
Absolutely. And thank you, Philly fans, for tuning in. See you next week for another podcast of Philadelphia baseball, past, present, and personal. This is Bill Kashatus, rounding third and heading home on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network.